Oh, hi there! Something I've wanted to cover for a long time is hoarded lost media. Highly sought after pieces of media that for one reason or another have been kept from the public. Whether it's for copyright or legal reasons, the rights holders are embarrassed by it, or a collector just doesn't want to share their prized possessions. There are a surprising number of such cases in lost media. In the arcade collecting community, hoarding rare games is fairly common. There are some high-profile cases like R.A.C.A. or Beavis and Butthead, but these are dwarfed by what might be the most infamous arcade title in all of lost media, that, though found and in the possession of at least 3 individuals, no one has been willing to make the game files public. This was a game I had long considered a lost cause. There were serious online discussions on whether the game would ever be released, most coming to the conclusion that no, or by the time it did become public, we'd all be long dead. This has been a crazy year for lost media discovery, and I thought it couldn't get much crazier. So imagine my surprise when I hop onto the Lost Media Wiki to see this. Marble Madness 2. Found. So what happened? Who released it? And why now? Well, before that, we need some backstory on both the original game and the most well-known owner of its unreleased sequel. The original Marble Madness is an arcade classic, developed by Mark Cerny and Bob Flanagan in 1984 for Atari. It's remembered for its visually striking MC Escher-esque 3D level design, where you control a marble trying to make your way to the finish line before time runs out, avoiding obstacles and enemies along the way. It's accessible, has a great soundtrack, addictive gameplay, inspired the likes of Super Monkey Ball, and is frequently listed among the greatest and most recognizable games of all time. But it wasn't perfect. Marble Madness was criticized for its short runtime with only 6 levels, resulting in players moving on from the game pretty quickly after mastering its few levels. So there was plenty of room for growth. There were even game features that were scrapped during development that could be implemented into a sequel. But the 80s were a different time. Companies weren't working on the sequel before the original was even out the door like they are today. But Atari were dragging their feet, even for the time, and the follow-up wasn't released until 7 years after the original, in 1991. Titled Marble Man, Marble Madness 2. The sequel was developed by the original developer Bob Flanagan, adding Mike Halley, a designer of another infamously hoarded arcade game that I'm saving for another video. They improved on the original short runtime by making 16 levels, with new features like becoming invisible, being able to fly, and making the marble giant, while also adding 3-player multiplayer, including pinball minigames between levels, and introducing the superhero mascot, Marble Man, to appeal to a younger audience. It was finished in 91, and as was common practice at the time, the arcade prototype cabinets were sent to various locations to get customer feedback, and the reviews were not good. Atari went back to the drawing board and changed the controllers from a trackball to standard joysticks and tested it again, with the same results. You see, by this time Street Fighter II was completely dominating the market. Fighting games were the next big thing, and Marble Madness was considered outdated and uncool at the time. Atari made the decision to permanently shelve the game in favor of the beat-em-up, Guardians of the Hood, which, while financially successful, wasn't very good. So what you might be asking is, if it was finished, why not just release it? Again, things were different at the time. Nowadays, most of the cost of making a game comes from actually developing the game, that are then sold on cheap, easy to manufacture discs, game cards, or just released digitally. But for arcade games, there was a serious cost that came from manufacturing the large, bulky cabinets and all its components. You can think of it like having to manufacture an entire console for every game sold. All of this to ship a single game, and they had to sell hundreds to recoup their investment. If the game might not sell well, it was a better idea financially to just scrap it and move on. Atari did consider making a home release for Marble Madness 2, and though it would be cheaper than an arcade release, they still chose not to. Marble Madness 2 was abandoned, leaving behind only a few prototype cabinets that were virtually unknown to the general public. The perfect recipe for lost media. Marble Man became the thing of legends. Rumors circulated that 12 copies of the game boards were made, only 3 complete cabinets existed, and there were even urban legends that all copies were destroyed by Atari for tax reasons. I know, paying taxes in this economy? But the arcade community is full of die-hard fans that will stop at nothing to collect rare arcade cabinets. And one such avid collector is Scott Evans, known in the community as Atari Scott. He gives a really great account of his journey that I'll leave in the description. It's a great read. I'd really recommend it if you want to get into the technical aspects of it. Scott's quest began in 1997 during a salvage operation. He was rummaging through a warehouse that was throwing away arcade game boards. While scrounging through the boards, I came across this strange board labeled Marble Man. But arcade games are made of a lot of different components. What Scott found was a PCB, printed circuit board. Basically the electronics, but not the actual game data. He was still missing the ROMs, PROMs, GALs, and soundboard. At this time, there was really no information about this game. It wasn't really widely known to the public. So Scott was facing a serious uphill battle. He looked online for more information and didn't come up with much. Arcade communities like RGVAC turned up nothing, and even Atari's customer support line was no help. I put the board away and figured it was a dead issue. I now had a nice paperweight. 3 months later, Scott once again tried RGVAC and actually got a response from Brian Wicklum, a producer on a number of games in the 90s and 2000s, who had some parts that he was willing to sell, but again, not any of the actual game data. I paid $400 for those pieces, and I felt very stupid, since I didn't even have a working board or the hope of ever finding one. During the second annual California Extreme Arcade Convention in 1998, Scott just by chance came across a Marble Man control panel in a storage room, owned by a staff member of the event, Ken Chaney. The control panel was the joystick model rather than the more interesting trackball version, but since Scott had so many other components of the game, Ken just gave it to him. So by 1999, Scott had everything except the actual game. Somehow he was able to find out about one individual that he knew had a full, working machine of Marble Man, Marble Madness 2, but was not willing to part with the ROM data without express written permission from Atari. Luckily, because of his time at California Extreme conventions, Scott had a contact at Atari who gave him the email of someone who might be able to help. And after waiting for a month, Atari actually got back to him. They said they sadly did not have the game's ROM on hand to give Scott, but they gave him permission to copy the ROM if he could find it. With key item Atari permission slip in his inventory, the owner of the complete game now agreed to share their ROM. But after months of trying to meet up, nothing came of it. It seemed the lead had dried up. After 6 months of waiting, Scott got a call from a friend who knew an ex-Atari employee who was selling some arcade games. Scott and this employee talked, but he wanted too much for common games. They eventually got on the subject of Marble Man, and the ex-employee had a funny story about the game. When being laid off by Atari, he had a complete working board of the game on his desk when he left the company. But more importantly, he thinks he knows who might have it. After what Scott referred to as, quote, social engineering, he was able to track down this mystery man who miraculously still had the board. The owner was hesitant, but after Scott equipped his Atari permission slip, he let Scott make a copy of everything, the ROMs, PROMs, GALs, and Scott went to work. I stuffed my board and crossed my fingers. I plugged it into my JAMA cabinet. When it came up, the picture was garbled, and the foreground objects were just blocks. One of the GALs was protected, and my copy was no good. I had 90% of what I needed, except one very important GAL. So close, but yet so far. Scott went back to his very first contact that he knew had the full game and begged him to meet up so he could have the GAL and unite the final piece of Exodia. The contact agreed. Scott took the GAL home, copied it, and plugged it into his machine. When I powered it up this time, the situation had improved, but there were still problems with the board. And this would demoralize any mortal man. A 3-year journey to restore a long-lost, unreleased sequel to one of the arcade's most classic titles, countless dead ends, red herrings, getting written permission from one of gaming's most important companies, and it still didn't work. But Scott, Atari Scott Evans, is no mortal man. He rose to the occasion. Scott would pour himself into the cabinet, meticulously combing the infernal machine, checking for any faulty wire or missing connection, and after 30 hours of hard work, he fired up Marble Madness 2. And it worked. It was perfect. He, at long last, had a working cabinet. There were only 2 more pieces to make it perfect. A working soundboard and the rest of the cabinet art. Scott made short work of the sound situation, modifying an existing soundboard that he already had, and once again went to RGVAC and found someone with unapplied cabinet art for Marble Man 2. They met up just in time for Scott to show off Marble Man for the first time at 2000's California Extreme. Scott would not stop there. He eventually came into the possession of a second Marble Man arcade cabinet, owning 2 of the 3 completed cabinets from one of the rarest and most sought-after arcade games in existence. The other is believed to be owned by the game's developer, Bob Flanagan. Scott would eventually sell one to an unknown collector, but no one who had ever owned a copy of this game was willing to share the data with the public. And for 20 years, they would not budge. Scott would bring his Marble Man cabinet and allow people to play the game every year at California Extreme, but firmly refused to dump the files online. Because of this, and other rare games in his collection that he kept to himself, Atari Scott became a polarizing figure in the arcade community. His supporters would defend him, saying he doesn't owe us anything, and he's gone above and beyond by letting people play the game at conventions, while his detractors say that he's being selfish by keeping the game from the wider public. Like I said before, arcade collectors are notorious for holding onto their collection very tightly. The most commonly cited reason being that the game would lose value if dumped online for anyone to play. And it makes sense. Typically, the more of something that's available, the less value it has. But I really think the founder of the Video Game History Foundation, Frank Cifaldi, dismantles this argument pretty well. I cannot imagine that extremely limited test cabinets from a cult following company like Atari can do anything but increase in value over time. From a preservation point of view, media this rare, not uploaded online, is basically an endangered species. All it would take is a few things to go wrong and the game's lost forever. Even if it was backed up, I cannot tell you how many times hard drive issues has led to lost content. I have known enough tech people to never trust when they say, "Hey, don't worry bro, I got it backed up." But no argument could sway Scott or the other owners of the game. But that would all change in May 2022. Out of nowhere, the game was dumped by a mysterious user under the name Dank2079 onto the Internet Archive. Like Billy Mitchell, I booted up the emulator and played Marble Madness 2, a game I thought I would never see in my lifetime. I get what the test audiences were saying. If I was a kid and had the choice between Marble Madness 2 or Street Fighter 2, I'd probably choose Street Fighter 2. And I really did enjoy this game, but there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of what made the original game and other arcade games so great, that they're easy to pick up but hard to master. Where in the original game, I would rarely make it past level 3. I could beat most of the levels without any challenge in the sequel. And in a lot of ways, the sequel goes overboard on the enemies, the collectibles, and path markers that show you exactly where to go, which makes it feel like the main challenge was just avoiding enemies rather than traversing interesting, well-designed levels. And I'm a bit conflicted because the enemy variety is great, but there are so many enemies that really don't add much of a challenge. And while we're talking about the visuals, the Marble redesign sucks. Even the game's developers say they regret this redesign. All in all, Marble Madness 2 did make some really great improvements over the original. More levels, more enemies, new abilities, and the enemy marbles follow you around the entire level. Seriously, these things follow you around like Nemesis in Resident Evil 3. But the sequel also makes some bad choices. Understandable choices, but still bad. That were, in all honesty, probably the reason the game was scrapped. But in Lost Media, we rarely have a clean storybook ending. We still don't know who made the game public or why they released it now. And the game isn't actually completely found. You might have spotted this from some of the videos I used, but there is another build of the game with slight changes. But most notably are these buff boy marbles when you beat the level. What I've dubbed the buff boy build has still yet to surface. And given that it took over 30 years for this one to leak, we could be waiting a while. So what do you think about this idea for keeping lost media for yourself? Do you consider something lost if someone has it but just won't release it to the public? This is a very common question that gets brought up all the time in lost media. I'd love to hear what y'all think. Maybe the better term is endangered media. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join them and get exclusive content, Discord access, and more, consider joining us at patreon.com/allthingslost. This is Mike with All Things Lost. See you soon.